So we looked at on the first day of Pesach the definitions or ideas about slavery and freedom on page 1. And today I'd like to start by looking at page 2. So what I'm going to do on page 2 is there are 8 quotes about freedom or slavery. I'm going to read them slowly so we can take them in. And then I'm going to ask you afterwards which one most touches you this morning, or that you find surprising, or you find interesting, or maybe not surprising, but worthy of holding up. We're going to, which is most relevant for our world today, or which is the most meaningful to you for your own life. However you're hearing that question, or however it resonates as I read the quotes, I'm just going to ask you to reflect on one of them. So be ready to pick out one. So we're going to start now. Anne Frank. I found that there is always some beauty left in nature, sunshine, freedom, in yourself. These can all help you. Look at these things, then you find yourself again. John Locke. Where there is no law, there is no freedom. Monique Wittig. There was a time when you were not a slave. Remember that. You walked alone, full of laughter. You bathed bare-bellied. You say you have lost all recollection of it, but remember, make an effort to remember, or failing that, invent. Toni Morrison. The function of freedom is to free someone else. HaYam. Freedom is taken, not given. Gloria Steinem. Power can be taken, but not given. The process of the taking is empowerment in itself. Henry David Thoreau. Disobedience is the true foundation of liberty. The obedient must be slaves. Angela Davis. We have inherited a fear of memories of slavery. It is as if to remember and acknowledge slavery would amount to our being consumed by it. So we're just going to focus on those today. Perhaps another time we'll be able to look at the quotes on page 3. Who wants to hold up one of the quotes from page 2 that I just read as being interesting, surprising, significant, meaningful, or relevant? Yes. Anne Frank. And why did you choose that? What touched you about her quote? Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Yes, she actually lived in Amsterdam, and yeah. She never made it to Israel. She was taken by the Nazis and died of typhoid epidemic that swept the camps. Thank you. Yes, but how beautiful that somebody who went through hell, really, was able to say that there's always some beauty left, and that there is actually freedom left, and that we have to find that freedom and look at it and find it within ourselves. That's really actually an interesting statement for somebody who was going through such, and wrote it while she was in hiding, right? She wrote about it when you'd think she was feeling less free, and yet still talked about finding the freedom within herself, and that there is always beauty left when you do that. Yeah, what? Beauty from ashes. Yeah, thank you. Love that. Yes. Anybody else want to hold up a different quote as being interesting, significant, meaningful, surprising, or relevant? Whether you agree or disagree with it, by the way. Nothing interesting. Yes, Ruthie.
I'm a little confused by 13.
Okay.
Where it says freedom is taken, not given, because I think obviously with our Constitution, we're given certain rights. But maybe the point of that is that we went through
Right. King George, like Pharaoh, wasn't really receptive to the idea of giving freedom to people, right? The revolutionaries had to do a revolution to get freedom from Britain. We Israelites, with God's help, had to get out to find freedom. Pharaoh wasn't giving it to us. So I think HaYam, who, as you can see, lived in the 19th and early 20th century when the Jews of Russia under the Tsar was not really receptive to having a conversation about giving Jews rights and freedom. In fact, Jews throughout Eastern Europe were mostly living under extreme anti-Semitism, but particularly in Eastern Europe. So Zionism was a major force there because there was a thinking that Jews needed to have their own space in order to have freedom, and that we needed to get that somehow, to take it or produce facts or something. So thank you for raising that. Yes. So, but you're right that once what's interesting about our experiment in America is that we then, instead of just saying, well, we got the power, so we're going to make other people not free, we're going to create a constitution that gives citizens rights. Fortunately, they did not extend that to people of color. Let's just to be clear. And the people of color who were taken forcibly from their homes and sold from Africa were not given freedom at the time. But at least there is an attempt to say citizens can have freedom. That wasn't quite necessarily the case after the French Revolution, where there was a lot of beheading going on. Yeah, do you have a...
Yeah, we're seeing a reversal of so much of that right now, whether we're willing to look at it, whether we're willing to witness what's happening. We should be witnesses to the laws that are changing, for lack of other words, if you will, for enslaving women again, for enslaving or eliminating LGBTQ people, for the incredible racism that probably has always been present in the United States, but is now becoming far more evident as anti-racists are, or as racist people are emboldened. So I think we need to be paying attention to what's happening in this country as laws are being changed in ways that will re-enslave many populations of people.
Thank you. So I think that's in some ways at the heart of HaYam's thinking, because just by naming us a democracy or naming us we're free doesn't really itself constitute freedom. As we saw from an earlier reading, I forgot where it was, but I think that it's very powerful that now that there are so many states that are limiting the rights of women and of all ages, and going to penalize them and anyone who tries to help them in any way. And the laws are getting more and more restrictive, because with each victory, there seems to be more of a push to take away freedom of taking care of one's body, freedom of movement, freedom of speech. There's now limiting what kinds of discussions you can have. And in schools, we no longer can teach about, in some states, you can no longer teach the history of the suffering of African Americans in this country, or you will be thrown in jail. You can no longer teach about sexual orientation or gender identity, even the science of it, what the scientists have to say, because teaching science, if you teach it about that, can land you in jail or in a major fine, etc. So the freedom of speech is also being taken away. So I appreciate your caution that HaYam invites us to consider. Thank you. Brenda, did I see your hand up about a quote?
No, but I here a little late, so could you really bother?
We're on page 2, and we read through the quotes, and we're picking a quote that is meaningful to us. Anybody else have a quote? Toni Morrison. Yes. Why did you pick that quote?
Because I believe that everybody gets free. We have to work on that. It's because we feel that we are free. And free doesn't mean that our neighbor or feels the same way, is not restricted by any people who insert him or her in safety.
That's right. So thank you. So actually, that kind of selfishness and the all about meism has now become caught on once again in America. And of course, we don't really live in an island, do we? We live with others. So there are now states that are passing laws that you do not need a permit to buy a gun. Even if you're a criminal, and even if you're on a terrorist watch list, it's okay because guns are important to me, so I don't really care who it affects as long as the law is available. I don't care if somebody has a mental health issue. If you limit it even a little bit, even sensibly, to protect others, I don't care. Let's just make it so I have the fullness of my freedom, right? That is where we're at in America today. But of course, that leads to not only chaos, but it leads to death. And of course, it limits people's freedom because now people are scared and students don't want to go to school because they realize that the government doesn't really care, or at least is not going, might care in some vague way. They'll offer thoughts and prayers after the fact, but have no interest in protecting children. You clearly do not care whether children get shot if you allow anyone at all to buy a gun no matter what, because you no longer need a permit and you can carry publicly in any public space, like a public school. And if you have guns around, they're going to be used. They're going to go off. That's what guns do. Guns don't go golfing, they shoot. That's what guns do. And people with guns shoot them. Okay, so thank you for raising that up, that the function of freedom is actually to help others, to free others, and not to live under the stifling nature of that. Thank goodness we in the Jewish community have always been about more and more inclusion. If you look at the history of Judaism, you can see it. Rabbi Fishel Perlmutter did a great study of this, and others, about how over time, Judaism was always at the forefront of opening up spaces and inclusion for epileptics, for people who are blind, for people who are deaf, for women, et cetera, et cetera. And whenever the changes came, when we look back from the 21st century, we might feel it was a little bit late. We wished it would happen back in the first day of Mount Sinai. But truth is, most of those laws were way ahead of their time and not well received by the rest of the world. And even today, that is the same. Jewish people were 87% in favor of LGBTQ plus rights back in the 60s, when other communities, the highest percentage was maybe 31%. And Jews were already 87% give people rights. So it's just sort of amazing. I'm not sure for us, it seems odd for us to think about religious communities inhibiting freedom. That sounds weird to us. How can you be religious and deny women the right to an abortion and say it's religious? How can you be religious and deny LGBTQ plus people basic rights? How can you be religious and not allow discussions to take place about science? Those things are all peculiar to us because we come from a heritage where asking questions, having conversations, comfortable and uncomfortable, is just part of our culture, and opening up spaces for people is part of our tradition and part of what we understand is what God wants. That is not always the case. Any other quote that anybody wanted to hold up? Yes.
Like the last one by Angela Davis. Freedom is wonderful, especially when you haven't always had it. And sometimes when you have gone through slavery, you don't want to remember it. You would rather stay forever in that space that is free, and you don't realize that you are a slave still. If you cannot accept that you used to be a slave, because that repression is slavery.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, thank you for bringing that. It's a lot, it's very deep, but sometimes our memories, we have to work with them and work through them for them to be able to liberate us, right? So thank you for sharing that. I'm going to be thinking about that. And finally, because we don't have a minute today, we can take a few extra minutes. I'd like us to turn to page 4. So you can see this painting. Some of you may, or I don't know, has anybody seen this before, this painting? Oh, at one time in the 19th century, late 19th century, it was hung in many homes of abolitionists. So let me talk about it. First, there was, this poem is by Jonathan Eastman Johnson, who was a founder of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. In fact, the next time you go, as you enter, you'll see his name as you enter on the door as you walk in, or above the door as you walk in. And he was really known for genre paintings in everyday life, but he really tried, he was part of the realist movement in his paintings. And part of his paintings, he gave great feeling about the Ojibwa Native Americans, the First Nations people, Ojibwa, and really painted them very realistically and appealingly. But he also did paintings of people of color, and very, very interesting for him. We'll maybe talk a little bit later, but I want to now look at this painting in which you have a child sitting on a tiger skin, looking curiously and actually quite happily at a jewel on her hand. You can see a ring on her finger. The ring is more than a piece of jewelry, which is why she is looking at it. And behind it lies a story of a person who had the courage to speak out for freedom when those views were not always possible. So we actually have a story within a story. So the man behind the story was Henry Ward Beecher. His sister was Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, a leading novel that was sympathetic to the experience of people of color at the time. He was the minister of the historic Plymouth Church in Brooklyn Heights. He was the first minister there in pre-Civil War days. And this great preacher could hold his congregation spellbound even when he spoke for hours at a time, something I'm not planning on doing now. You should all feel comfortable. But he led one of the first things he did was to lead his congregation against the fugitive slave law of 1850. That law required even free states and even abolitionists to participate in returning escaped slaves to their enslavers. The idea of the law was unthinkable to Beecher and to his congregation, which his congregation became known as Grand Central Depot of the Underground Railroad. In fact, the main room was actually under the sanctuary where they davened on Sunday. I don't think he called it davening, but they davened on Sunday, and there was a tremendous room underneath, and he really wanted visitors and everybody else, like whether they knew it or not, but the congregation was in on this. And he condemned his fellow preachers, particularly in the North, for refusing to speak out strongly enough about slavery, which he called the blackest iniquity of the age. Probably a double meaning to that word blackest, I'm not sure. He says they condemn the small sins because it is safe, but they keep silent on the important sins. They're courageous enough only to condemn a person for using tobacco, but can't say one word against selling men and women who raise it. It can spend itself and exert tremendous machinery against the awful sin of the dancing of young men and maidens, but can't utter a word when maidens are sold to prostitution and young men are driven off in chain gangs to the rice swamps of Georgia. He spoke very, very powerfully. He not only was against the slavery of Africans in our country, but he also spoke out against the exploitation of young women for prostitution, which actually goes on today. In our country, there are millions and that affects almost all women, usually young girls of between 9 and 18 or 16, who are trafficked. And he was already speaking out against human trafficking and also against the use of poor people for cheap, free labor, and who always got the raw end of the deal on the legal thing. But he not only preached against the evil of slavery and trafficking, he practiced what he preached. In February of 1860, he brought to the pulpit Sally Maria Diggs, whose picture you see here, who was 9 years old and a slave, a girl of color. She was actually known as Pinky because pink was her favorite color. And she was to be returned to slavery unless they could raise, I believe, $2,200. So he took her to his congregation and he told the story in a way that only Henry Ward Beecher could. And then they passed around the plate to try to raise enough money on the spot from his congregation in Brooklyn Heights. One girl in the congregation, Rose Terry Cook, had no purse, but she did have a valuable opal ring on her finger, which she treasured. When the collection box reached her, she dropped the ring into the box. Henry Ward Beecher, upon receiving the plate, saw that he had well over the $2,200 needed. So he saw the ring. He took the ring, lifted it from the mountain of coins, placed it on the ring of Pinky as a token of her freedom, and exhorted her, "With this ring, I do wed thee to freedom. Now remember, this is your freedom ring." Pinky got an education and became a teacher and changed her name to Rose Ward. The Rose after Rose Terry, who dropped the ring onto the plate, and Ward after Henry Ward Beecher, who saved her life. This became an iconic moment for the abolitionist movement. Beecher himself brought Pinky to see Eastman Johnson within 2 weeks or so. He had just completed a successful exhibition at the National Academy of Design, which featured his masterwork, Negro Life in the South, which portrayed the different kinds, cultures and peoples that were African-American with their different shades. Not all African-Americans look alike, nor do they come from the same culture or even speak the same language, right? And he painted this picture. The title, of course, has a little bit of a double meaning or even triple meaning, right? It is literally a depiction of Rose Terry's ring, which was part of the collection to win Pinky's freedom. But it also became symbolic of the flight for freedom of enslaved Americans of color. Indeed, the picture was reproduced, and many had a copy hanging in their home. Just as in the civil rights era, many African Americans had pictures of MLK, many African Americans and many abolitionists and allies had this reproduction of this picture. But it also reminds us of the patriotic song, "My Country 'Tis of Thee," which ends, "Let freedom ring." The original song actually subverted a song that celebrated the monarchy of England, but words were put to it in 1831 that were about democracy. So you had words that originally came from England celebrating the monarchy, God save the Queen, God save the King, that were subverted, and we used the melody to say, no, 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 we're never again going to celebrate monarchs, we're going to celebrate democracy. And we're going to prove it to you by changing the words but using the melody. And now, Eastman Johnson's title, Freedom Ring, also reminds us that this is a lie. Because freedom doesn't ring until we all ring in together to make sure there's more space for people of color and for women and for LGBTQ plus people. Democracy in his time still allowed for the purchase and ownership of persons. So I want us today, as we conclude Passover today and tomorrow, to think about the meanings of freedom we've explored today, the different quotes we've read and what they might have meant to us, to think about how freedom and democracy are going through difficult times right now, as Ronnie reminded us, with laws against abortion, laws against speech, laws against LGBTQ plus rights. What red seas do we need to cross as an American society? What can we subvert to help enhance the promise of democracy and the aspiration of freedom that we often say are hallmarks of our country? I'm going to leave us with that question today as we return to our service, but it's a question that we shouldn't drop. It's a question that demands ongoing consideration, ongoing conversation, both comfortable and uncomfortable, with people who share our ideas, and when possible, with people who are unclear about what to do and what's the best course for America. There may be some people with whom we maybe shouldn't have a conversation. That may not always be productive, but don't only think about having conversations with people you already know agree with you pretty much 98%. Find somebody who agrees with you only 85% or 75%. Talk about some of the nuances of freedom that we talk about today. And continually, day after day, let all of us ensure that we let freedom reign. Go. Aratia.